Welcome back to our walk through the Bible. We are in the book of Numbers today, and this book, like Leviticus, is one that is easy to discount, but when you read through it, you find out that there are stories in Numbers that we don't get anywhere else in Scripture that are so vital to our understanding of the nature of God, the expectations He has of leadership, and there's even a type of Christ being lifted up on the cross. It's found in Numbers. So it's an interesting book to study. We want to get just a brief overview of it, and we want to begin with thinking about the title Numbers. There are two numberings, if you will, two census that are taken, one before the 40-year period of wandering in the wilderness, and the other after with the new generation. These numberings are for the purpose of preparing the men 20 years and over for war. How many men that age do we have ready to go to war? So the first numbering is found in chapter 1, and you can see the purpose for it there in verses 2 and 3. Take a census of all the congregation of the sons of Israel by their families, by their fathers' households, according to the number of names, every male, head by head, from 20 years old and upward, whoever is able to go out to war in Israel. This is about 13 months after the Exodus. They've been camping around Mount Sinai. They're getting ready now to go into the land that God has promised to give them. So we have that first numbering there, and with the total that we see in verse 46 of 603,550, it's been estimated then that the overall number of the children of Israel at this time could be anywhere from 2 to 3 million people. That is a lot of people for Moses to have been leading out of Egypt. But remember that in Exodus chapter 1, verses 7 and 12, there were comments made about how fruitful they were in Egypt, how they had multiplied and increased. So it is a very large number, and we can see that even with this first numbering. The second numbering is over in chapter 26 and verse 2. Same thing. Take a census of these men that are 20 years and older to prepare for war. This is after the 40 years of being in the wilderness, and so it's a new generation of men, and you have the tribes in the same order, different numbers with each one of them, and indeed the total found over in verse 51 of chapter 26 is 601,730. So it is those two numberings that give us the title of the book being Numbers. But there's so much more that is going on in the book of Numbers besides these two taking of the census. 19 days after the first census, if you go over to chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, when it's time to move out, we have this exciting opportunity for faith, for the children of Israel to express their faith. God's given us the promised land. Let's move out. And that's in chapter 10, verses 11 and 12. It's time to set out to go on our way. And there's yet one final warning given in verses 9 and 10. And or not a warning, but a reminder of God's presence. It's really interesting in chapter 10 because we have the specifics given as to trumpets. There are to be these trumpets that are made, and the blowing of the trumpets will, among other things, signify that God is with you. Verse 9, when you go to war against the adversaries who attacks you, then you shall sound an alarm with the trumpets, and then you'll remember that the Lord your God is with you. The same thing at the end of verse 10. When the trumpets are blown on these feasts and memorials, it's a reminder that the Lord is with you. So that's some of the final instructions before they move out is you're not going out alone. This is going to be a journey with God as it has been up to this point. And so moving forward was an expression of faith. And yet, just 3 days into their journey, we see that the complaining begins. Just 3 days into this journey. You see in chapter 11 that people are complaining as if they are in times of adversity. And as they're doing that, we see the Lord's response. And this is an important theme throughout Numbers, the way that God responds to complaining against Him and against His leaders. And so there in chapter 11 and verse 1, we see God's response to this complaining with torching the area around him. His anger burned, and there was literal fire. And the people cried out to Moses, we're sorry. And Moses intercedes for them. And then the fire is put out. Well, that's right there at the beginning of chapter 11. And then beginning of verse 4, we have this group that's referred to as the rabble, both in the New American Standard and the New International Version. And these are the people of mixed company, mixed race. There were others that came out with the Israelites from Egypt. And so these are some people that came along with them, and they're greedy for more from this God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so they complain about the manna from heaven that God's providing. They're saying, we want some meat. And they have this really skewed view of what it was like back in Egypt. When they say in verse 5, we remember the fish which we used to eat free in Egypt, and the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic, and everyone's thinking, yeah, it makes you wonder, was it even close to that? I guess there was fish, but they're just thinking of this beautiful banquet, evidently, that they used to have, and now are complaining against the manna. And we have the description of the manna in verses 7 and 8. And so we have this complaint going on. Well, then that results in another complaint, and this time it is the complaint of Moses. There in chapter 11, verses 10 through 15. And Moses' complaint to God is, I didn't birth these people. They are your people, and I am carrying all this burden, and it is overwhelming me. And just to show you how discouraged Moses was at this point, he will say in verse 15, just kill me. If this is my life to bear this burden, just kill me, God, because I am so tired of this complaining. And what's interesting is there's going to be a whole lot more complaining after this, but Moses was already fed up with it. And so God's response to Moses' complaint was the appointing of these 70 elders. In verse 17, they're going to help bear the burden with him. He's going to have a team. And then if you will look at the end of verse 18, God also responds with saying, I'm going to give you meat. And so we have the quail that are going to be provided by God, beginning in verse 31. And yet the rabble, those of mixed company, those that were so greedy in their request, they're greedy when he provides the quail. And they just begin gorging themselves on this quail. And that causes the anger of the Lord to burn as well. So we have the complaining at the beginning of the chapter, the complaining about needing meat, the complaint of Moses, and then we come over to chapter 12 and beginning in verse 1, and we have the complaint of Miriam and Aaron. We're like, well, what could they possibly be complaining to Moses about? Oh, the text says it's because he married a Cushite woman. And some say that there was something wrong with the marriage, and that's why they're upset. But remember that Aaron and Miriam are sharing some leadership with Moses. And so there are some scholars that suggest that, particularly with Miriam, that she's getting jealous of another woman entering the picture and is wondering now if she's going to be a part of the leadership team. So God's anger burns against that as well as he hears about it. And yet in verse 3 of chapter 12, Moses, being humble as he is described, he will again intercede on their behalf, particularly as you go through this chapter and you see that she is struck with leprosy. Miriam, that is struck with leprosy. And the question is asked to her and Aaron both at the end of verse 8, why were you not afraid to speak against my servant, against Moses? It's a key passage, and there's several others like this, where God's saying, why were you speaking against him? Why were you so arrogant? Why did you have the audacity to speak against this man that I am speaking to you through? So after all of that complaining, it brings us then to Kadesh at chapter 13. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more. Casey and I are going to discuss this in just a few minutes. But it's there that they come to chapter 13, and after all this complaining, all this negativity, and there's a reminder, okay, God is going to take us into this land, but first we need some leaders to go collect some fruit from the land and come back and just tell us more about this. These leaders were supposed to inspire. They were supposed to rally everybody together. And of course, that's not what happened. And so this pivotal moment became a time of fear, where the 10 of the 12 leaders that were sent in began talking about what might happen to our women and children because the inhabitants in the land are strong. Remember, they'd had this numbering to show how many men of war they had. And they had the reminders of the trumpets that God's present with them. Even in their travels, they would have the ark before them and the cloud covering them. And yet these leaders were saying, we just can't do it. We can't do it. They could have entered into the promised land then, but instead, after that 40 days and the bad report they gave and the people rebelling again against Moses, wanting a new leader, wanting to stone Moses, complaining against God, that's when God says that they will spend 40 years of wandering. And then there's going to be that other numbering of the new generation, which will then have an opportunity to go in to the promised land. So let me give you just a brief 3-point outline. Chapters 1 through 14 is Sinai to Kadesh. We just covered that period. There was their opportunity in chapter 13 and 14 to go in, but they did not. And so the second point is chapter 15 through chapter 20, verse 21, and that is the wilderness wandering. There are different things that happened during it, including Korah's rebellion against Moses and Aaron. Thought that everybody could be leaders, that everybody was holy, everybody could be in the priesthood. And of course, the book of Leviticus showed us that that was not the case with all of the Levites, that it was to be Aaron and his sons. But we have that going on in that particular section. And then the final section is Kadesh to Moab, chapter 20, verse 22, all the way until the end of the book. And it's in that section that we have the raising of the bronze serpent. Again, a response to complaining. The people were complaining. God sends these snakes that when they bite people, they die. Moses intercedes on their behalf as he does throughout the journey. And so God says, okay, fashion a bronze serpent. You hold it up. Those who are bitten, when they look upon this serpent, they will live. And Jesus will quote that in John chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, right before the passage of God so loved the world, right before that is when he refers back to that bronze serpent. And even as the serpent was lifted up, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes on him will be saved. Well, one of the saddest verses in Numbers, when you think about all the times that Moses interceded and prayed for the people and caused the people to be spared when God was ready to wipe them out because of their complaints, the saddest verse in the entire book to me is in chapter 20 and verses 2 through 12, where the people are complaining for water, and God tells Moses to speak to the rock. And Moses, perhaps having a time before this when he struck the rock, thought, okay, well, that'd be okay to strike it instead of speak to it. And so he takes matters into his own hands. Seems like a minor infraction on our part, but he strikes the rock instead of speaking to it. And God will say to him, chapter 20, verse 12, because you have not believed me to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given you. And again, our personal emotions get caught up in that, but if we just look at that verse, what we're seeing is that God had very high expectations of leaders, and a very high expectation, of course, of Moses. And he would be treated holy. It kind of reminds us of Nadab and Abihu back in Leviticus. They carried a greater weight of responsibility in their example and in what they were showing the people as far as the holiness of God. Well, thank you for joining us for this sprint through Numbers. Next time we'll be in Deuteronomy with that new generation ready to go into the Promised Land. Well, Casey, I'm glad that we have just a few minutes here to take a look at this pivotal moment with those who have come out of Egypt. They've been numbered. It's time to move forward and to go into the land that God promised to Abraham that they were going to receive. And yet we got these two chapters, chapters 13 and 14, where things fall apart because of leaders. And I think that's an important point for us to start with. We talk about the spies that went into the land, but these aren't little spies sneaking around in the way that we think of spies. They're leaders.
Right, and God gives them the direction to scout out that land. And so they're chosen by the tribes to be the scouts, to be the leaders. And it's not some covert mission or anything like that. It's, let's go see what God's given us. Let's go see what God is providing for us.
What you're saying there is given them the mission for them in verses 18 through 20 of chapter 13. Go see what the land is like. Bring back some fruit. But nowhere in that mission does it say that these leaders are supposed to make the determination of whether this is going to happen or not. That's already been decided.
No doubt, no doubt. And I do think that God is trying to set up a way to show His glory, a way for Him to show that He's in control and He's going to take care of His people. How many months ago was it that they were coming out of Egypt in Exodus? I believe is 15, something along those lines. Mm-hmm. So just a little over a year later from the Exodus and coming to the Red Sea and overcoming those kind of things, God is wanting to show His glory again.
Right. And we just wonder if we were in their shoes and we'd seen all these demonstrations of God's power, at what point would we say, okay, yeah, we believe God, nothing's too difficult for God, to quote from Genesis 18:14, but that just wasn't the case each time. So let's talk about those 10 spies that came back with their part of the report. And of course, there's a large part of this report that is exactly correct. After they come back in 40 days, verses 26 and 27, it's all correct. They are reporting on what they saw.
Yeah, and the phrase that is used over and over, it's a land flowing with milk and honey. And,
yeah.
And so it is a great place for them to come, and God has prepared a promised land for them, and they're really excited about that. But then with those 10 guys, fear comes into effect.
Verse 28 is where it all starts to fall apart. Nevertheless.
Yeah. And that they weren't designed, or they weren't commissioned to go and give this report. It was, tell us about the good things. Tell us about, even if you tell us about how fortified they are and how great the cities are, show that also that trust in God and that trust that He's going to help take control.
Absolutely. And so verse 28 is not just a shift in their mission, but now it is taking it up into a spiritual confrontation with God, particularly as we get down to verse 31, and they're saying, we are not able. Well, it never has been about their ability.
Yeah, and the other thing that you can see as this text unfolds is you can see this mob mentality. You can see the leaders inciting the different tribes to be angry. In fact, like in verse 30, Caleb is trying to quiet down the people as they stood before Moses, and you can see this tension that's happening of, oh my goodness, we're up against it again. There's going to be so much destruction there. We're surely going to die in this land. And so I just think it's interesting how a leader is sent to do something that God has commissioned them to do, and the way that they react is in a negative sense, but it also rallies people in fear and anxiety and starts to turn against God in that way too. It speaks volumes of the leadership ability of these 10 spies.
Right. Being a visionary doesn't mean that you're being unrealistic. But in the spiritual leadership role, it means reminding people about us not being alone.
That's right.
We've got the ark out here in front of us. We've got his cloud over us. We have his presence demonstrated and his power demonstrated so many times. That's the role of the visionary, to remind the people that this is about God's promises. And when you talk about the fear there, I was thinking about over in verse 3 of chapter 14, where they go right into this, our wives and our little ones, they're going to be plunder, and they fall back into that same thing that we've already seen. It'd be better if we were in Egypt.
Yes, it's crazy how they can misremember, and they can rationalize things for their current argument. The other thing that I think is really important out of verse 3 is he says, "Why is the Lord taking us into this country only to have us die in battle?" And there's an underlying tone there that God is setting them up for failure. That God is bringing them to this point and then all of a sudden is just going to crush them. There's an old rabbinic tradition that says that this was the sin of the people, that they believed that God had set them up for failure. And we as fathers, we know we want the best for our kids.
Right.
And we want the best for our children. And that's the same way with God. God wants the best for his children. He wants the best for his people. And so why is it so easy to buy into this lie of God setting us up for failure? We're surely going to be destroyed. We're surely going to be crushed. And I think that that's very important for us to even realize today, is that God wants good things for us. He does not set us up for failure.
That's really a good point. And, we're talking about leadership principles here, but there's also some lessons for those that are following leadership in different platforms, different respects of, okay, look at how that leader is leading. Are they focusing on fear, or are they pulling us up to a vision of things being better? A leader's responsibility is to create that new vision, to help us see that vision, not to just create this atmosphere of fear. 2 Timothy 1, verse 7, God's not given us a spirit of fear.
That's right.
But of power, love, and discipline. So I think that speaks as to the discernment we ought to have in listening to leaders. Are they constantly preying on our fears?
That's right. And I would also be very curious about Joshua and Caleb's relationship with God. And because you can see it overflowing in the way that they communicate. You can see that I don't want to go against God. God is providing. God is taking care of us. 15 months ago, we walked over on dry land across the sea, and God is always taking care of us. And in verse 9 of 14, do not rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of this land. And I just love their confidence that they've seen the same reports that the other 10 guys are reporting. And they're saying, man, don't go against God.
Think of all the pressure that they would have had to say, okay, we're outnumbered here. We'll just see how this turns out. But instead, they stand up and really contradict these other leaders.
Yeah.
As well as looking in the face of all of these people who are filled with fear that are already called. When you were talking about down there in verses 8 and 9 of chapter 14, well, back up in verse 4, they had already called for a new leader with Moses. And so that tells you just how all of this has been ratcheted up. And then look at what happens to Joshua and Caleb by standing up for the Lord.
That's right. And then the people that have been incited in this riot, in verse 10, the whole community began to talk about how to stone Joshua and Caleb. And so these men are telling the truth. These men are giving God the credit, and they're faithful to God, saying, God, we know that this is a big task, but we know that you can give it to us. And so the people are all of a sudden, they're wanting to kill them. They're wanting to take them out. And what also really annoys me about all of this is that there have been times in my life, and my wife can testify to this, where I have been flat wrong. I've made mistakes, I've messed up, but when I'm called on those mistakes, and when I realize, man, I have really messed up in this situation, okay, I can admit, all right, I need to move on and go a different direction. Joshua and Caleb are speaking the truth. Joshua and Caleb are grounded in their faith in God. And where are the other 10 men when they hear this faithful report? Where are the other 10 men in calming down the crowd, saying, all right, you know what? They're right, because God has been faithful to us. I'm really disappointed in the other 10 men for not repenting of their error there.
And maybe their response to that, Casey, would be, well, we were just trying to do the right thing. We didn't want to see the people slaughtered. So we were trying to do the right thing. But they were leaving out God and His promises. So the greater the challenge, the greater the opportunity is for God's glory
That's right.
to show forth. So the fact that this is going to be a large challenge is a key component in this. So bringing back that report that, yeah, these people are large, their cities are fortified, is an opportunity for faith.
Yes, absolutely.
So what really always impresses me or strikes me about Moses is we see over in verses 11 and 12, God's response to all of this that's going on is, okay, I'm just going to wipe them out, and Moses, I'll just start all over with you. But in verse 13, we have Moses interceding for the people again, just continually. That's his response of interceding for. Now, it doesn't mean he doesn't get discouraged at times, but he's always interceding for the people, and in verse 19, praying for the people, forgive them. And the Lord responds to his spiritual leadership with forgiving them, although there's going to be the punishment for in the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, but he forgives them in the sense that he didn't wipe them out. So
that's right.
Moses, his leadership just continues to stand head and shoulders.
That's right, and
above everyone else.
I love the interchange between Moses and God. They have that relationship where Moses can help God in seeing, okay, here's a bigger picture, and that doesn't mean that God didn't have a bigger view of things, but it also shows the leadership of Moses and his ability to stand up and speak for the people that God has asked him to speak for.
Yes, he was thinking about God's glory, because there in verse 13 it says, what happens if the Egyptians hear of it?
That's right.
So he is thinking big picture, like you say, and not just the small picture as those other leaders were. Well, I'd like for us to finish up with verse 24 with the wonderful phrase that describes Caleb. He has had a different spirit and has followed me fully. What a great description of a true spiritual leader, one who has a different spirit and is following God fully. That's the kind of leader I want to be, and I know you do as well.
Absolutely.
I've enjoyed discussing this with you. There's so much more that we could say, but hopefully this will continue with some other discussions in your home. Thank you for joining us.